Hey guys, welcome to My Sew Bliss. Today I'm super excited to be partnering up with Baby Lock sewing machines to teach you a few sewing terms. I'm going to be teaching you 8 sewing terms that any beginner sewist or seamstress needs to know to get started, to read patterns, to do all the fun things that you do in sewing. So I'm going to be using my Baby Lock Zest, which is this cute little machine right here. This is one of Baby Lock's basic sewing machines. It's one of the machines in their genuine collection. It is a great lightweight machine to travel with, to take and carry around the house. It has all your basic sewing needs. So I'll leave links down below for it so you guys can make sure to go check it out. And I'll be showing you all of the stitches and terms that I'm talking about. If it's a sewing, needs to be shown on a sewing machine, I'll be showing you how to do it on this machine. The first term that you need to know is seam allowance. Now, this refers to the stitch line or the stitching, the amount of space between your stitch line or stitching and the edge of the fabric. When you're sewing, this term is going to be referred to a lot in the amount that you're going to be stitching at. So a lot of times it will say a 5/8 inch seam allowance or a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And that just refers to that amount of stitching from the fabric edge into the fabric where you're going to put your seam line or do your stitching. The second term that you should know is going to be stay stitching. Now, this is a line of stitching that helps so fabric doesn't stretch when it's being moved or the garment is being constructed. So this is really important on things like a neckline or armholes, especially on loosely woven fabrics that will stretch or shift when you move them. The third term that you should know is going to be basting. Now, this refers to loosely sewing the garment or pieces together so that you can see how it fits, or just so it sews it in place for the time being, but can be easily removed later on. So usually when you're basting, it's going to be a longer stitch that, like I said, can be easily removed later on. This is helpful if you are just trying to figure out the fit of, say, a shirt. So you baste all your pieces together quickly. So it's done quickly. You can check the fit and then take that stitching, that basting stitch out, and then do your regular stitching. You can finish off the seams, all that fun stuff that you do in your project. When you first start sewing or working with fabrics, you want to know what our fourth term is, which is the grain. Knowing what the grain is important because it helps you to line up your fabrics so they lay nicely on your body once you've constructed a piece of clothing or sewn something. It isn't like skewed and wonky, weird and wavy. So knowing what your grain is on a fabric and knowing how to adjust the grain is really important. So there's going to be a cross grain and a lengthwise grain. The lengthwise grain usually runs vertically from shoulder to hem. The crosswise grain usually runs horizontally and has more give or stretch. This goes more into what warp and weft are, and we can talk more about that. I actually have a really old video on warp and weft if you want to go check that out. But just knowing that it is important when working with fabric to put your sewing pieces, your patterns on grain, and make sure that lines up correctly is really important when you get started sewing. Our fifth sewing term is going to be notch. And this refers to a line or triangle on a pattern piece that you are then supposed to transfer to your fabric. You can either cut that triangle outwards from your pattern piece, or typically I just do a little snip into the fabric, making sure I don't go too deep because that would then cut the fabric more, but just within our seam allowance. So there's that other term for you. And that helps us line up the pieces, the pattern pieces later on when we are doing the constructing of the garment. Our sixth sewing term is going to be gathering, and this refers to putting a bigger piece, putting long stitches in it, facing like stitches. You usually do about 2 to 3 rows of these stitches and pulling them so it creates a ruffle or a gather, and putting that into a smaller fabric, smaller piece of area. So you could gather a skirt, an arm piece could go into the sleeve and have a gathered to make that poof. So I feel like a lot of patterns have some sort of gather or need a tiny bit of gathering stitch to create some desired effect. So it's important to know what a gathering is and make sure you know how to do that. Like I said, it's a long stitch, usually 2 to 3 rows, and you pull those to fit the desired area, and then you stitch that in place, and that creates a gathering or a ruffle for your garment. Our 7th sewing term is called top stitching. Now, this is when you stitch on the right side of a garment or a piece of clothing, and it can serve as a decorative stitch or just something to make the garment look more professional or tailored, or it can be a functional use to keep something in place, sewing something together. So top stitching, it's a stitching that's going to be seen on a garment, but sometimes it's both functional and just a decorative look or something that makes it look nicer, more professional. If you check a lot of your clothing at home, maybe your store-bought clothing, you can check out and see like, okay, this stitching is seen on the outside of the garment. That is what the top stitching is, which leads me to our 8th sewing term, which is understitching. This is not seen on the right side of the garment and is used typically when you have a facing. A facing is another piece of fabric that gets sewn on, usually on like a neckline. You'll have a front facing or a back facing or both, and to help it stay on the inside, it finishes off the neckline. So to help that stay on the inside and not be seen, you do what is called understitching. It's still like a top stitch looking thing. It's just something that's not seen on the outside and helps to pull or maneuver that facing to the inside so it is put away and not seen. So those are the 8 sewing terms that I think everyone should know, especially if you're just getting started sewing. It's really important to understand what those are. I hope you guys found this tutorial video helpful. Make sure to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe so you can see more sewing tutorials and sewing content. Make sure to check out the Baby Lock Zest. I'll put a link down below in the description for it, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!